Hi, everyone. My name is Bill William Smith, and I am a professional services engineer with Jamf. And joining me is Joel Seeger from the last session, and he's the principal architect of this new feature that we're going to be talking about today. So before I begin, just want to let everybody know that I have already told my coworkers I am going to have my next paycheck direct deposited into that dollar jar that Dean was talking about yesterday. So if I say Jamf, if I say Casper, I mean to do that because I don't have anything else to say. I just forgot. All right. So inside Jamf, we have several development teams. And before we begin, I'd like to give a quick shout out to Team SpiderPig. They're from our Poland office. Today we're talking about single sign-on and what it means for you and your users. This was Team SpiderPig's first major project. So here's what we're going to cover. First, we're going to define what SAML and SSO are, and then we're going to discuss the parts of SSO. Then we're going to go through the steps to configure a test identity provider, and then how to integrate that with your JSS. I meant to say that. All right, so first, let's talk about SAML 2.0, or the Security Assertion Markup Language. Defining SAML is probably easier done from right to left, so let's start from the far right. SAML is a markup language, and as Mac admins, you're probably already familiar with a few of the markup languages like HTML and Markdown and XML. HTML is prevalent in web pages and email formatting. And Markdown is probably a more readable version to HTML, and you'll see it in popular blogging software, forums, and you can even use it in your JSS. And XML is the common markup language for exchanging data between a variety of platforms and systems. We'll find XML all over the OS, all over Mac OS, especially in plist files. All right, so getting back to SAML, let's define an assertion. Assertions are used to pass information between the end user and the identity provider. Now, we're going to talk about what an identity provider is in just a little bit. So SAML uses three types of assertions. We have an authentication assertion. That identifies a specific user who was authenticated and at a specific time. It does nothing more than verify that user. We have an attribute assertion, and that includes user data such as name, email address, first name, last name, the user's role. It might be admin or a standard user of some type. And then we have an authorization assertion, which states that whether a user is allowed to even log into a resource such as a website or your JSS. So the identity provider manages all of this. While they don't necessarily use SAML, they use OAuth, which is more for internet authentication. You've more than likely used Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Google to identify you to a third-party website. These organizations are acting as identity providers, and they're allowing you to log in with credentials that you already have, and so you don't even have to create a new user account. So the service provider integrates and trusts with the identity provider, and it gets the proper authorization from there. This would be your JSS, or self-service. Jamf currently supports these identity providers, and because SAML 2.0 is a standard, your JSS should integrate with any identity provider that supports that SAML 2.0 standard. And that's where the security comes from in SAML 2.0. Similar to using Active Directory for Mac logins, for file share access, SAML allows a client to use a single identity to access multiple resources. This is called single sign-on, or SSO. The difference between the two is that SAML is only for web services. So, however, you can integrate Active Directory with an external identity provider, and that properly will secure you for authorization for users outside your network without exposing a domain controller. And we'll talk more about that in a bit. All right, so now let's talk about what's involved with the process of securely authenticating a user to access a website. The user experience takes place through the client's browser. That's what you see here in the blue right here in the middle. So pretend that's Safari or Google, Chrome, or Firefox. All right, the user browses to the JSS over here. The JSS responds with the SAML request and then redirects the browser to the identity provider. The identity provider parses the request and authenticates the user. Then it returns it to the browser, and then the browser passes the response back to the JSS, which grants access to the browser, to the client, and then finally it allows login. So it's a back and forth process, but it all happens as far as the user is concerned just in the browser. All right, now that we know what SAML is and the process behind SSO, let's see what it takes to set up a test environment. This is probably what you're mostly interested in trying out. All right, first, we need to configure an identity provider. I'm going to use Okta for my identity provider. Okta offers a 30-day free trial. It's easy to set up and configure quickly. So if you want to try this out with a dev environment, I recommend that, but don't forget we support other providers too. So before we configure our JSS to work with Okta, let's set up a simple application such as Office 365, and we'll see how that works. Okay, I have set up Okta. I've done nothing to it other than enable an account. So now, after signing up for my Okta trial, the first thing that I'm going to do is add my application. So many online services support SAML, including Office 365. I just need to search and then click the Add button. Here, I add my Office 365 tenant name, domain. I then configure my method for sign-on. In this case, it's just username and password. Toward the bottom of the page, of the setup page, I choose what my username looks like. Now, for Office 365, the username is the same as the email address. I'm going to skip provisioning settings for Office 365 for now. This is where I could provision and configure many users at once. For now, I'm only enabling Office 365 just for my test account. And then finally, I assign my user who should be able to access Office 365 using single sign-on. And that's it. It was just nothing but a wizard right there in the web browser. So when I visit my application dashboard as the user, I now see all of my available Office 365 applications available to me for single sign-on. I haven't connected Okta to my Active Directory domain yet. So the first time that I try to access Outlook Mail, Okta is going to prompt me for my username and password. And then from that point on, it's going to manage my password. When I click the sign-on button, I'm taken to Office 365. My browser is redirected between Office 365 and Okta. And then I'm authenticated and finally logged into my account. As the end user, all I see is the Okta dashboard with my web applications. I choose one, enter my password, and from that point on, again, Okta manages my passwords, including password changes. So that's a fairly easy setup. Now, Okta can also act as a cloud directory service for small organizations, but larger organizations, like most of you have, are going to probably want to utilize your existing directory services, such as Active Directory. That's where integrations come in. So now, I'm going to return to my dashboard in Okta. I'm going to do another wizard. I'm going to choose to add a directory integration. For this example, I'm going to add my Active Directory domain, Talking Moose. I'm instructed to access Okta from a domain joined server on my network. So because I only have one domain controller in my test environment, I'm installing the Okta agent on my domain controller. But remember, it doesn't have to be a domain controller, just a domain joined server. On the server, I'm going to download the agent, and then I'm going to follow the instructions to run the installer. Toward the end of the installation, I'm prompted for my Okta administrator credentials. And again, I'm still on the server. From there, I need to grant access for the agent to access my Okta account. Finally, I get a confirmation that the agent started. And coming back to Okta now, I'm fine with my basic settings in Okta for how it's going to read Active Directory. However, I do want to make one small change, and that's toward the bottom of the basic settings page. I'm going to change the Okta username format to use the SAM account name instead of the user principal name. Now, that could be different for your organization, but for my testing, this worked out well. All right, so by default, Okta syncs the most common user attributes such as first name, last name, username, email address. You can select more or less user attributes to actually sync down from Active Directory to your Okta account. And that's all it takes to set up Active Directory. That was it. Again, it was just going through the wizard here in Okta and then installing an agent on a server. So the next step is to import users and groups from Active Directory into Okta and then to activate their accounts. You can schedule imports to run routinely too, so if you're importing new users each night into Active Directory, you'll get them into Okta later. All right, so after configuring your identity provider and connecting it to Active Directory, the last step for single sign-on with your JSS and self-service is to connect to your JSS to the identity provider itself. All right, we're going to log into the JSS. We're going to choose single sign-on under System Settings. Jamf's website, by the way, has knowledge base articles for all the supported identity providers. So for this procedure here, I'm going to be following what's here documented on our website. And it does require configuring your Okta account and your JSS simultaneously. You're going to be working back and forth between the two. So in Okta, back in the same area where I added my Office 365 integration earlier, I'm going to choose to add a new application, and then I'm going to choose the option to make a new application for my JSS. For my sign-on method here, it defaults to basic, but I'm going to make it SAML 2.0. I'll name my application JSS just to keep it simple and recognizable, and I can even upload a logo like the Jamf logo to make it easier to identify. All right. Then I'm going to follow that Jamf knowledge base article and start entering the settings that it specifies. Now, don't do like I did. I don't know if you can read this or not, but I left out the 8443 in one of my settings. If you're using an on-premise JSS that uses 8443, don't forget that. So in my single sign-on settings back in the JSS, I have the option to enable just JSS access or other services. I can choose to use the username or email address as the mapping between my JSS and the identity provider, and that's the unique identifier between those two services. That's what helps them both identify and understand they're talking about the same person or same account. And similar to configuring LDAP to work with the JSS, I can even specify the relative distinguished RDN of the user's primary group. For my example, I didn't have to do that. I can set the name of the identity provider along with the metadata for my SSO service, and I can specify the entity ID of my identity provider that it should use to identify my JSS. And last, I'm going to upload the same third-party certificate bundle that I use to encrypt my website. So this is for verification and encrypted SSL communications with my JSS. Whenever you log in, we'll use the same certificate bundle to keep that communication up to Okta encrypted as well. So once I've configured the JSS, the last step is to test. I'll log out of both Okta and my JSS, and then when I browse to my JSS's URL, I should get redirected to Okta, which is what you see here. This indicates everything is working normally. At this point, I should see the same Okta sign-in and redirection pages going back and forth that I saw earlier with Office 365, and then I should come into my JSS dashboard. And that's pretty much it. And I should point out that at no time did my identity provider play any part with controlling what I could access in the JSS. Those privileges are still managed by the JSS on the user accounts and groups page. They are not managed by Okta. Finally, when I sign out of the JSS, instead of returning to the login window, I instead see a message telling me that I've successfully logged out. This is different from the non-SSO behavior where I would actually be returned to the login page. All right, so what happens if my identity provider goes offline or my JSS has problems connecting to Okta? Well, by adding a question mark failover to the end of my JSS URL, I, as an administrator, can bypass SAML integration, and then I can access the normal sign-on page. The question mark is a query string. It allows me to pass additional information with my URL to the server. So once I add the question mark failover, now I can log in using either a local JSS account or even an Active Directory account, an LDAP account. Your JSS isn't the only service that you can access with single sign-on. You can take advantage of SSO for user-initiated enrollment and self-service too. So remember, user-initiated enrollment is still a web application. It's still your JSS, and self-service is based on WebKit. So therefore, if I've chosen the option earlier to enable SSO for self-service, users will be redirected to Okta to sign in. And then they'll be redirected back to my JSS after authenticating, and that's where my self-service applications and tools are available and waiting for me. So taking that beyond just the JSS, if I enable all of my organization's web applications for SSO with Okta or whatever identity provider I choose, my users then not only get a unified experience across platforms, but also a simplified experience across platforms just by having one centrally managed password. So single sign-on. What does it mean for you and your users? Similar to Active Directory, SSO and SAML allow users to access multiple unrelated applications securely using a centrally managed name and password. In fact, SAML can integrate with Active Directory or most any LDAP service to utilize its database of users. Unlike Active Directory, though, SSL and SAML are safe to deploy over the internet, and they don't require that you expose a domain controller in your DMZ. So if you're not using a directory service, your SAML identity provider can still act as your primary directory for all of your applications. So that's the presentation. I did have somebody tell me that there was a session tomorrow related to what we were talking about today about JumpCloud. If anybody's interested in checking out what JumpCloud has to offer, you might be interested in attending that session as well. So at this point, we'll take questions, and then I'm going to make Joel answer all the questions because he knows all the answers about the workings of SAML and SSO.
Okay, thank you very much. There were quite a few questions that have come in, most of them related to how cool the Spider Pigs team are and whether they get to wear cool t-shirts. Those ones I might skip for the time being. Some of the more technical questions that have come up. What restrictions are there on the certificate uploaded to the SSO identity provider? Is the private key required?
No, private key is not required. No. I don't know if you need any more elaboration on that, but Whatever key you want, you can use. And by the way, the T-shirts the spider pigs get, I got one. They're pretty cool.
Answered 2 questions at once. If I used a failover URL, does that bypass the SSO service?
Yes, it does. It does. And I don't know if you noticed, for using the failover, access can only be granted to those who have SSO access privileges set up as their profile in the JSS. But there also is another checkbox you can click that allows everyday normal users to actually bypass SSO as well. So if you still have regular users in the JSS or in an LDAP, if they go directly to your JSS URL, nothing after the .com /8443 or whatever, if you select that configuration, users can log in directly to the JSS that way as well.
Cool. Without AD or LDAP, what are the minimum permissions a JSS group needs to allow users to sign into self-service using an identity provider?
Actually, it kind of works as it does today. If the user doesn't exist in the JSS, they're still allowed in because it is self-service. So they'll kind of get that minimum level, and we'll go ahead and use that username to create a profile for them. But again, if they do exist, then we'll use their, if it's in just JSS accounts, we kind of use that permissions at that point to specify what they get to see.
Cool. These are coming in quickly now. Will authenticating through DEP using an SSO such as Okta instead of LDAP be an option in the near future?
There would have to be some changes made in conjunction with Apple, just because of how that timing works. We'd have to be able to interrupt and say, hey, this new machine, you need to be able to kick over to the identity provider, get privileges, and then come back and then start laying stuff down. So there really isn't something there today that we could use to kind of jump in at that point to make that kind of thing happen.
Is support for two-factor SSO authentication coming?
We don't have it. I know we have it on the backlog, but I would say once you're using an IDP, it's certainly easy enough to pop in two-factor authentication with other two-factor companies, or even putting in your own. So with stuff like Okta or Ping, again, it's pretty easy to kind of pop that in and do it through them versus having to do it through having the JSS pop up and do two-factor authentication.
What's the behavior seen in self-service when the identity provider goes down?
It's chaos. Problem at that point is, so the JSS would be redirecting to the IDP. We are not going to let you in unless we can authenticate through single sign-on. So, the failure then you would get denied. That would really be what would happen. Again, because we require that if you authenticate through your IDP, you're good to go. We're going to let you in. So you'd want to get your identity provider back up and running.
So would users end up seeing the same failure message? So I haven't seen this myself to test, but would users end up seeing the same failure message as if they were authenticating to Active Directory?
It's been a while since we looked into that one, so I can't say for sure. Either you're going to get a specific message saying that we can't contact your identity provider, or you're going to just get denied. I do know for sure that we do log it in the JSS saying, hey, we can't contact. It's just I can't remember what we're actually showing the user at that point.
If you logged in once already in your computer with another SSO-enabled application, would you have to log in again to your JSS?
No, it should be seamless. Of course, you'd still be going to the IDP. You'd get that information. You've already signed in, but that should then come back through. If you exist in the JSS, you're good to go.
What about Kerberos? What if I never want my users to have to enter credentials?
Right. I mean, let's see. You may stump me on that one. Can you run that one? Run that one by me again. Just
I've forgotten which one it was now.
Kerberos.
What about Kerberos? What if I never want my users to have to enter credentials?
Well, I mean, I know that works fine for for iOS today, and you can set that up with web browsing and whatnot. Maybe you can restrict things because iOS actually works with Kerberos. I mean, this is really kind of a different thing because typically your IDP is external. Your Kerberos stuff is going to be internal. I know whoever asked that question, if you want to come up later, maybe we can dig into more detail because yeah, I might not be quite getting exactly what you're asking.
Well,
so
like if you're running ADFS on a local internal server as your IDP. So if you're running an ADFS server on a local box inside your network instead of going to an external provider,
yes.
using that using that instead.
Oh yes, because ADFS is perfectly fine, yes. So that would not be a problem.
General question. I live in an almost completely NTLM only Windows world. Can I use SSO as a proxy to access NTLM websites?
Can't say I've looked into that one. I don't really have an answer for you. Sorry, I don't live in the NTLM world, so yeah. So I can't say I have an answer for you on that one. Unless, Bill, you can, yeah.
And I have one more at the moment. How does the SSO login pass the LDAP or AD group during the login to Jamf, particularly if a user doesn't already exist in Jamf?
Oh, so for a group, we're looking at a group?
Correct.
Okay, so really there's, within your SAML, what's coming back, there's a group claim. So you can go ahead and set that up so that, making sure that that mapping is appropriate. Based on the IDP that you use, you may have to tweak a thing or two. You'll see that in the knowledge base articles on how you want to set that up. But it is there so that whatever groups that they belong to will come across. And you can bring all groups across. How we do it is if you send in for a username, we'll take a look at that first, see if that matches up with a JSS account. If not, then we'll go to groups and see if those sync up with the group in LDAP in this particular case.
Does the web interface time out the user session according to Jamf server settings or the identity provider?
So there's two settings, right? One on the identity provider side, one on the JSS side. When it comes back over, the token is going to be set based on the session from the ID, what is in the JSS itself. So it's a bit of an override. One thing we try to recommend is you make sure you sync them up so they're the same, so that then there isn't any confusion as to when they get logged out or whatnot. So.
And I think you've done a fantastic job of the on-stage interrogation there. That is all of the questions for the time being. I would encourage you, I'm sure these guys would love... Oh, we have one more. Wait one moment. It's the last one, I promise.
Sorry, forgive me, I don't actually have Twitter, so I can't ask a question on there. I know I'm an IT admin.
I'm not either,
Twitter
it's
well.
okay.
I have an environment very similar to what you've described. So we have AD syncing up to Okta, and then I've been trying to set up Okta to use SAML authentication for our JSS. Now I've managed to get that working perfectly fine for our sort of administrator accounts, but our end users, so users that would only log into self-service, never log into the JSS, they actually get denied logging in to self-service, so it's opposite behavior what you're talking about, where the user's saying, no, you're not a member of a group or a user in the JSS. Have you seen that behavior before? Or?
I have to take a look at the settings because we can specify some some things.
Yeah,
whether
so
it gets
basically,
in or not, and
if I add a group of all our AD users into the JSS and give them no permissions, I can then get them to log into self-service, but they can also log into the JSS then, but not have any rights in the JSS, so I don't really want that behavior.
that doesn't seem like typical
Yeah,
behavior.
I've raised it with your support team, but just
Sure.
wondering if you're aware of it, so.
I haven't seen that particular issue, but it's not what's expected behavior.
Okay, cool.
Okay, guys, we will call it a day there. I'm sure both Bill and Joel will be hanging around to answer any other questions if you do have any. I hope you enjoyed the session, and thank you very much.